This is Yesterzine, the literal magazine show where an issue's worth of old games are dragged out into the cold light of a post-Brexit nuclear winter and made to dance for our pleasure. This issue focuses, not coincidentally, on a time of much promise. It's late 1993 and Future Publishing launched the original PC Gamer magazine into a world of 486s, DOS and PC games on floppy disks. At least unlike most of the Amiga owners, we could install them to a hard disk. This was indeed an exciting time for PC gaming. Issue 1 of Gamer is packed with classics. We're not even going to have time to look at Frontier, the sequel to Elite for instance. There just isn't the time. We'd be here all day and I've got some important despairing at the future of humanity to do. And speaking of the future of humanity, let's clear up an honourable mention.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its mission? To explore strange new worlds. To discover new life and new civilizations. To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Well, this is nice, isn't it? It feels like being in an actual episode. And of course that was a rather bigger thing in 1993 than now. Not least because Star Trek was less than half as old then. Next Generation had actually just come to an end on TV, and the horrible withdrawal was probably about setting in as they released this, the second of 2 Star Trek point-and-click adventures. I didn't play these at the time, and it's clear they've aged. The starship combat is incredibly clunky, and the landing party sequences are very reliant on you doing exactly the right things in the right order, via a slightly complex system where you use your crewmates on items to actually interact. For instance, to hack the computer here, you have to use Spock on it, then use both tricorders on it, then use Spock again. Not realising you need any of those individual steps means you might think you didn't get the right solution, and the last thing your average point and click needs is making you think correct solutions are the wrong ones. This is actually in support of a neat side system though. When you finish a mission, Starfleet Command ranks you on the job you did, how much you investigated, and how much you discovered. It means it's one of those rare adventures with a modicum of replayability, especially as in some cases there are 2 ways to achieve something. Escaping the cell at the beginning, for example, can be done by persuading the guard, whose father you know, to let you out. Or by tricking him into walking into the cell and nerve-pinching the bastard. Still, I can't see myself wanting to play through these in 2019, even with a walkthrough for the story. It's just a little bit clunky. What was depth in 1993 is now really just frustration and tedium, which is a shame because it's obvious this was made by a team that cared about the subject matter. Heaven this month is driving sim Indycar Racing. But before we get there, an aside. This is the 3rd time in 4 issues I've mentioned Jeff Crammond's Formula 1 Grand Prix, and that reflects just how much of my life it took up. It's 27 years later and I still remember the moment I realised I'd had it in heavy rotation for a full year, which was an absurd amount of time to a 12-year-old. I've used a static screenshot in previous episodes, but it might be time to at least give it a brief spin. Because it's important to know what a fundamental change to the beast F1 GP was. Its predecessor in my affections, Accolade's Grand Prix circuit, had 3 drivable cars, 7 fictional opponents, and less than half the barely recognisable circuits of an F1 season. Then F1 GP came along. It had all 35 entrants for the real 1991 Formula 1 season, with as correct a livery as you could muster on an Amiga. They had fake names, but that was easily edited away. It had all 16 circuits, rendered in full, if textureless, 3D. It had all the real weekend structure. It had comprehensive setup options. It was Formula 1. No doubt we'll talk about it some issue, but obviously there's room to improve. The lack of textures and an 8-a-second frame rate on the Amiga being chief amongst them. The latter of which was fixed by the PC version, but I never had that. About 2 months before this issue, we'd upgraded the family PC from a 5-year-old Epson to a shiny new 486 Compaq. Power was available, and it was time for a challenger.
I'm Paul Page. From Papyrus, this is Indycar Racing.
We'd seen Papyrus before with a fun but limited simulation of the Indianapolis 500 race a couple of years earlier. But given Jeff was both effectively a one-man band and a perfectionist, the sequel to F1 GP was still nearly 3 years away. Therefore, Papyrus's full simulation of IndyCar, effectively America's answer to Formula 1, was understandably big news. And look at the thing. Rich textures, great frame rate, solid looking physics. And we're only running this on an admittedly high-end period PC here. It would be entirely reasonable for it to look like this. The other drivers and liveries are mostly real, minus some licensing issues with the car and team of Brit Nigel Mansell, who had his own game at the time. Weirdly, this didn't stop them putting his car, which isn't in the game, right there on the menu background. It has most of the tracks from the real 1993 season, although only half of them originally shipped with the game and the others were a later DLC pack. Notably though, it misses the Indianapolis 500 itself. Climbing into an IndyCar for practice at my favourite circuit, Laguna Seca, I can see how impressive this was to me coming from F1 GP. Look at the thing shift. The circuit, while in hilariously low resolution by today's standards, still looks basically real. My muscle memory immediately clicked in, and within a couple of laps I was lapping roughly around the 1 minute 17 mark I remember as being about what I could usually do with keys back in the day. Even the replays show just how much of a step this was. You can see drivers fighting each other even when you're not around, searching for alternate lines, passing each other. This was, and is clearly, the next genuine evolutionary step after F1 GP. Even a quarter of a century on, it's immediately recognisable what it did and represented at the time. Somehow the spirit of the game hasn't been dimmed by time, even if its graphics and physics absolutely have. You couldn't call this a realistic game in 2019, of course. One look at Laguna Seca in a modern IndyCar using Project Cars 2 makes that perfectly clear. But it's still also so clear what every modern sim owes to this. Some of them literally. Papyrus went on to make a sequel to this, and a decade worth of excellent NASCAR games using evolutions of the same engine. They were also responsible for Grand Prix Legends, a game still talked about in hushed tones in certain circles. The company disappeared into the Sierra Activision Vivendi Blizzard mess somewhere in the mid-2000s, but the main names went on to found iRacing, a subscription-only simulation that's the hobby and training tool of almost every real-life racer. It also spearheaded motor racing esports, and NASCAR now crowns the digital champion from its iRacing hosted series alongside its other winners every year. It's not for the faint-hearted or soft of wallet, but after 25 years, Papyrus's staff are still king of the Sims. We've got some cover discs to look at here, and perhaps this is the time to explain just how important they were. I got internet relatively early, I'd say, but we're still talking 3 years after this issue was released. Plus, of course, I'm 13 at this point. I had a console or two, but games for those were very much restricted to lucky birthday and Christmas gifts. PC and Amiga games, having tiny media costs, could be had cheaper when a few months old. But even so, it's not like I could be down Future Zone every week getting something new, which made demos important, and the only way to get those were on magazine cover discs. Not only were they my only real chance to truly test what I was about to spend my limited funds on, a lot of the time they were really the only new thing I had to play full stop. And they were hugely important to the magazines themselves too. People chose magazines as much based on the contents of those discs than anything in the actual pages. With the possible exception of the one Amiga, I was never really loyal to any particular magazine, and I was not alone. The 8-bit magazines were able to load their cover mounts with old complete games, but an agreement with the Publishers Association meant this didn't happen for the 16-bit machines. The Amiga magazines relied on freebie games, such as Omega Race from Episode 1, but at this stage, the PC magazines were all about getting the best demos. Which explains firstly why PC Gamer went all out to get 5 exclusive demos for their first issue, but also made such a shout of it on the cover. We've only got so much time here, so I'm going to skip over Disc 2. Sub-War 2050 was a largely successful attempt by Microprose to broaden the appeal of its simulation submarine games with some arcade concessions. Krusty's Super Fun House was a fun cross between Lemmings and a Simpsons platformer. and Graham Gooch was a game involving cricket in some fashion. So let's concentrate on Disc 1. And first up is Micro Machines, one of the ultimate party games. If you don't know Micro Machines, then they were these tiny little toy cars, maybe half the size of a normal small toy car. If you can't picture it, then basically imagine what a full-size car looks like next to your mum. That's how small they are. And of course, when we had them as kids, we set up races around the house, over the dining room table using forks as crash barriers, or in the bath between layers of bubble foam, or across your desk when you were supposed to be doing your homework. The game Micro Machines recreates all these, and as a series is one of the best party games ever invented. One later version on the Mega Drive both allowed 2 players to share a joypad and had 2 extra joypad ports in the cartridge itself, making it one of the first and few games to support 8 players on a screen. This only had 2 players, but it could certainly cause arguments with its head-to-head format, where you win points by running your opponent off the screen. Many a childhood argument began with a cheeky punt off the side of a desk. The one-player game ain't bad either, taking the form of a series of 4-car races across all the tracks. The neat twist is you pick your opponents, the skill being, do you take on the good opponents early on the easy tracks, or will you get further by leaving them in the toy box as long as possible? You eliminate opponents by them having lost sufficient races, so there is some strategy to proceedings. I wouldn't play this now though. Get hold of Micro Machines 2 on the Mega Drive, and 7 of your about-to-be-formerly close friends. There are still new Micro Machines games today, but it's been diminishing returns since the 1996 version. And besides, we have something much more important to move on to. I told you in episode 1 this was going to come up. Beneath the Steel Sky was the Revolution adventure game I actually played, coming after Lure of the Temptress and before the start of the Broken Sword adventure series that's still running to this day. As well as being reviewed in this issue, falling a mere 2% short of winning it, a demo of Beneath the Steel Sky was the highlight of the cover disc. It's a futuristic sci-fi comic book adventure, to the extent that the whole thing was overseen by Dave Gibbons. Dave has worked with Alan Moore, and outside this game is best known for his work on Watchmen and on 2000 AD right from its first publication.
Scheming in the dark, gathering strength, and now...
So this game has a style, exemplified perfectly by the intro you're currently watching. Like Aladdin last issue, it has a style that comes from an influence outside video games. The story is comic book thin. Robert Foster was stranded in the wilderness as a child by a crash that killed his mother and is adopted by the tribal locals. As a young adult, security forces arrive looking for him. On the way back to the big city, the helicopter crashes. This man does not have good luck with transport, and Robert needs to escape the city and find out just why the hell he's important. Like I say, so far, so comic book. But that's a strength. Beneath is using a video game to tell a non-video game story. It's one of the moments in which gaming grew up. It wasn't that many games at this point that had a plot that wasn't some girl, and it's depressingly always a girl, gets kidnapped. Even other adventure games were usually paper-thin jokes like Space Quest. It meant something, at least to me at the time, that video games were being trusted to deliver what felt like a proper story. That was a deliberate driver in developing the game. Revolution were looking for something between what they considered the uptight seriousness in Sierra's games and the slapstick comedy in LucasArts. Personally, I think that undersells both competitors. Sierra had Space Quest and Leisure Suit Larry, for instance, and slapstick comedy is not my first reaction to Loom. I think too this might have been the first adventure game I had that was voice acted. Which, much like Indycar Racing, meant the whole thing had a "this is from the future" vibe to it. Although what I didn't notice then, and probably have to accept now, is that the acting, and quite a lot of the dialogue, is pretty terrible.
As he patched me up, the old man had gently explained that there was no way back into the city, and I already knew there was nothing he could do for Mother.
It's got a comedy robot sidekick for BB-8's sake. Although, to be fair to them, that was at least marginally less cliché at the time. Sky uses an upgraded version of the virtual theatre engine from Lore, and it eschews the clunky verbs of the LucasArts games, the text parser that Sierra was still just about clinging to, and even the icon-driven interface of Star Trek Judgement Rites and many later games. In general, it's simply left click to walk or look, and right click to do whatever the most sensible thing to do is where you right click. So left click will look at this rung, right click will pick it up. Left click looks at the item in your inventory. Right click will pick it up to use on screen. And a right click on this lever means pull it and not try to detach it. It all makes perfect sense, and it's self-evident as soon as you play it that there's really no need for other adventure games to play dumb when you're trying to make something work. The joy of an adventure should be in the plot and figuring out what to do, not in trying to make it do that thing. It's not perfect. Early on you find a new robot shell for Joey in a pile of junk. But until you look at the right spot in the junk, it's all identified as one pile. It's only when you look at what subsequently turns out to be that shell that Robert realises he can use that specific bit and it changes now. Still though, at least the labelling gives you a clue there's something there.
Listen, we're in deep trouble.
I'm deliberately restricting what I'm showing you to the first half hour of the game here, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, because that just about matches what you'd have had on the demo disc if you bought this issue. But secondly, because you don't need that demo disc. Like Lure of the Temptress, Beneath a Steel Sky was released as freeware back in 2014 or so. You can download it in many places, but both Revolution and I recommend Good Old Games at GOG.com. There you can not only get the CD edition of the game, but the manuals, some HD wallpapers, and even the beautiful Dave Gibbons drawn comic book from which the game intro is taken.
Can you start that transport?
If you're a portable gamer and feel like dropping $3, a remastered version is available on iOS. It uses better quality sound and has hotspot highlighting and a hint system too. It's a perfectly good and slightly more forgiving way to play the game. But whichever way you choose to play it, choose to play it. If the evolution of video games was itself a game, Beneath a Steel Sky would be a checkpoint, and one whose save you'd keep to play again later.
Buffing and polishing tool, and an extendable probe.
And keep that comfort in your mind, because you know what time it is.
Can't we just stay here?
It's a double helping of hell, because Speed Racer picked up 27%, and Andy Butcher described it as quite possibly the worst full-price PC game of 1993. We'll get to that in a minute, because there's some evidence Andy might be mistaken there, because in this very issue there's another game that somehow managed to get 6% less. Tesserae? 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 Teasmade is a puzzle game involving coloured tiles. That much I can state with certainty. Much more, though, is going to involve us diving into this. The in-game manual has 15 pages of instructions. 15. No game that isn't trying to intimately simulate the space shuttle should need 15 pages of instructions to understand the basic concept. Reading it forwards a couple of times, and then backwards, and then double-checking it wasn't in Dutch, the basic concept is that this is some kind of turbo one-player drafts. I should probably explain that for anyone younger than Generation X. Drafts, or checkers if you're one of those people that massively underused the letter U, is a board game played on an identical board to chess. Pieces are captured and removed from the board by jumping over them. That's the case here, except the rules are complex in a way you'll struggle to figure out by there being 3 levels of piece, denoted by primary, secondary, and tertiary colours, each being a group of the colours you make with 2 of the previous ones. The object in a level of Teasmade is to remove all the tiles, ideally in the lowest possible number of moves. Other than some truly obtuse presentation, there's nothing specifically wrong with Teasmade. It's absolutely logical as a puzzle game, and indeed you can win by puzzling it out. What it's not, though, is engaging or interesting. Nor is it something that wouldn't be trivial enough to set out on a real board, making spending full price on a PC game with no AI to do it entirely pointless. Actually, I lie. There is one thing absolutely wrong with Teasmade, and you've been hearing it for a couple of minutes now. This really is the entirety of the music. You'll hear more rhythm and variety of sound next time you press a button to cross a busy road. And it's a metaphor for the game itself. It does the job, but it's not a pleasant experience, or one you'd want to subject yourself to if there was a choice of listening to, or doing, literally anything else. So Tesserae is bad, but what it's not is interestingly bad, and it's for that reason I want to look at this next game, because a thrown together speed racer game absolutely has the potential to be both interesting and awful. If you've not heard of Speed Racer, it's a manga, and later anime, about motor racing. It's been around for 50 years in fact, under its real name of Mac Go Go Go, being published in book form in 1966, and as a 52 episode TV series a year later. You might also remember it from the 2008 Hollywood film loosely based on the premise, which incidentally is much better than it was given credit for. So is this story of a racing family, a man competing in honour of his dead brother, and a mysterious masked racer called Racer X, a game equally hard done by? Well, the music is certainly better. In fact, it's lovely. For the period, this is a beautifully animated intro too, and even explains the plot a little bit.
Speed, you can be a great driver, but you can also be a great man. You value a life even higher than victory.
But from now on, we're professional racers again, and I'll do my best to win. I'll try to beat you.
I accept the challenge!
Good luck.
As a driving experience, Speed Racer immediately reminds you of the Road Rash games on the Mega Drive. And indeed, this game was originally supposed to be on that system, where frankly it might have made more sense. It's a standard 2D tunnel track racer by Play, with 11 opponents in a race. The standard driving is spiced up a little by special abilities. You start with a spring to jump over opponents and a turbo boost. As you earn money through racing, you can buy additional ones and carry over any 4 into a given race. It's a smidge more depth than you might have been expecting in this game, and it is welcome. Less welcome are the bugs. There's graphical glitches aplenty here, and the game gets confused. It's never obvious if you're in the middle of a long crash after a bump or just briefly off course. And as you recover, your opponents have an annoying tendency to drive straight through you, meaning one mistake is often a 1st to 12th affair. This means most races are just trying to get to the front alive as quick as possible before it all gets too busy, and from then, generally, you can get away and not see them again. Often just by finding a big jump and employing the spring and boost to leap over half the field at once. That said, there's a charm to this game. I can't argue with the review as such, especially at full price. But as a way to spend a throwaway afternoon, there's fun to be had here. It goes about its business with joy, and while ultimately it's playing at the kiddie pool end of the depth gauge, it's fun. If we're being honest here, its status as an arcade game means it's aged better than Indycar Racing has. I'm not claiming for a moment this is the better game than that is, even now. But if you're asking me which one I'd rather go back and have a quick 10 minutes on when I finish this bit of the script, it's this one. And if you think I'm mad, there was a very neat little one race demo version on cover discs at the time. I'll link it in the comments for those of you with DOSBox. Give it a punt. And with that, we've outstayed our welcome. Our back page of this issue carries an advert for DOSBox, the easy to set up method of running these old games on your PC. You can pick up a copy free for Windows, Mac and any number of Linuxes at DOSBox.com, along with several front ends that'll help if you're the kind of person who's going to give me a weird side eye when I say, just mount the hard drive in AutoExec.bat. On the inside back page, like PC Gamer, we have an excellent subscription offer. You can subscribe for free by simply clicking the button. Click the bell as well, and YouTube will even tell you when we release an issue or a bonus extra. If the sheer lore of Tesserae is what attracted you to this series for the first time, check the playlist for 3 or more other issues to starve off crippling ennui for over an hour extra. If you wish to spend several hours debating if the physics are worse in the movie or the game Speed Racer, then you can email yesterzineshow@gmail.com, comment on the video, or visit our site at yesterzine.co.uk. There will be another issue very soon, and until then we'll be in the playground interrupting the Amiga and ST owners to point out the PC is best. Toodle pip.